Welcome to the Arabesque sewing studio. Now today I have a fun little add-on pattern for the Crafted Life Companion. Now the Crafted Life Companion is an A5 journal or notebook cover that comes with tons of storage, as you might know. And as part of that we gave you a spot to hold your favourite pen. But as I was designing this pattern and thinking about all the different ways that we use a journal and a notebook, I thought, what if we need more than one pen? And so I decided that as part of my idea for intentionality and slowing down and just the way I love to use a journal, I realized I love to create and I love to highlight, I love to sketch, and I love to just showcase parts of my journal that are more important or something that I would like to remember. And so I designed a little add-on for this pattern and made a little pen holder with an elasticated strap. So this little pattern is called the Inkwell. So the Inkwell is a little pouch that sits on the cover of your journal or your notebook and holds a few of your favourite pens and gives you a place for your favourite markers, your highlighters, if you love to sketch and draw in your journal, maybe a pencil and eraser if that's what you love to do. So this little pattern is part of my intentionality and mindset pattern series. This pairs perfectly with the Crafted Life Companion because it really helps you to slow down, just enjoy creating and decorating and highlighting your journal and your notes so that you can just have that quiet time of reflection and enjoyment that helps you step away from the chaos of life. It really does pair beautifully with the Crafted Life Companion because it can sit on the front cover or on the flap, and it can actually fit any A5 notebook cover. So this is a very simply constructed pattern and only uses a few small pieces of fabric. So if you've got some little scraps you'd like to use up, maybe some bits left over from your Crafted Life Companion, then that's going to be perfect for making one of these. Now I do have to say, because this is small, there are some little fiddly bits that you're going to need to master. So I do recommend you bring your patience hat, but the results of sewing this are so worth it, because this is so cute and such a functional little project. Now, if you love sewing organisational videos that help you grow in your confidence and your skills, I'd love you to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. Now you'll find a copy of the pattern and all the supplies I'm using linked in the description below. So if you would like to sew along with me today, grab a copy of your pattern and your supplies and we'll get started. Let's run through the tools that you're going to need to sew this pattern today. I've got a little quilting ruler here, which is great for transferring marks and measuring things. I've got a range of fabric safe pens that I'm comfortable using on fabric at different places and stages. I've got my seam ripper, which I would never sew without. I use this all the time. I've got a couple of different scissors, and I love using these micro tip scissors just for getting into tight spaces and trimming off my thread ends. I've got a stiletto, which is really useful for holding all the layers together when you're sewing a particularly fiddly piece. Also helping you with keeping control of your layers, I've got some glue. So this is fabric safe glue, a fine line glue tip. And if you don't have one of these, you can also just try one of these little glue sticks, which is also great. Now the needles that I'll be using today, typically I sew most of my projects with a size 80, 75-80 Microtex needle. But when things get a little bit thicker, I will up this to a 90. So you might want to try that as well. I've got a bunch of binding clips, which are great for holding all the layers together as well. Sometimes use a rotary cutter to cut my pieces out, and a little tool that you might not have used before but is great for turning through this little project. These are hemostats. So they're not scissors, they are a clamp, and they help you reach inside a very narrow space and grab it and pull it out so that your fingers don't have to do that for you. And this can pull way harder than your fingers can. So this is a great little tool to have for turning this right side out at the end. So this is another project where accuracy really matters. So you're going to need to cut this out really carefully, trace really carefully, and then cut out the fabric really carefully so that everything is going to fit together really nicely. So on pattern piece A, which is the front of this design, you'll see we've got some little triangles here on the bottom of this curve, and that's where we're going to sew a dart in each of these places. So that's where we bring the little arms of the triangle together and we take out the bulk or the corner of this curve, and that's going to help give this front its lovely shape that sits up off the back of the fabric. So I'll be showing you how to do that, so don't be intimidated by this. This is just another way that we add shape and form into the design that we're going to create today. So everywhere that you see one of these little notch marks, you're going to go ahead and just cut a little tiny V into the paper so that you can mark that place with your pen. And with my stiletto, I'm also going to punch through these little circles here and mark a dot at the top of each of those darts. So on each of these templates that show one of these marks, you're going to go ahead and mark the centers where necessary on each of these pieces. So let's run through the pieces in this pattern. So this is essentially just a little pocket that has a strip of elastic sewn onto the back. So when we open out the flap, you can see it fits 3 pens comfortably in here. And when we take them out, you can see that there's a front section, and this is where we have the darts. And on the back, we've got a back and a flap section that join together where the central elastic strap is going to sit. And this also joins at the bottom as well. And then we've got a strip across the middle here that holds down the flap, and that can be a little tiny piece of 2mm round elastic. And I'm going to give you a few options here. So I've also got some 3mm flat elastic here, which is also a very nice dainty size for fitting across here if you don't have any little round elastic. And today I'm also going to be showing you how to sew a little fabric strip where we use fabric instead of elastic, which is going to save you going out and having to buy some matching elastic if you don't want to. Also, this elastic on the back here is a 5/8 width double fold elastic, which comes in a lovely range of lovely shiny, sheeny elastics, and I just love this because you can match it to so many projects. Of course, you can use any flat elastic that you would like, anything you've got on hand, but just be aware that not all of these elastics will stretch at the same rate. So I'll be showing you how to fit this to your notebook based on the elastic that you've got, so that you can make sure that you get this to fit snugly and not too loose and not too tight. So we're going to be working with a couple of different interfacings today. So whenever I work with woven cotton fabric, I always like to fuse some woven interfacing onto the back, and this just stops everything stretching and helps it keep its shape. And then on top of that, I'm going to be fusing a layer of fusible fleece. So the interfacing stops everything stretching, and the fleece gives it a lovely plush padded feel, and together these just work really well together. So I do recommend that you try and get these interfacings. You'll find them all linked in the description below, and this will just help you get a lovely shape to your project. So when I'm working with interfacings, I always fuse the woven interfacing first, followed by the layer of fleece. So just make sure that you don't fuse your fleece directly because you can melt it. And I will also be transferring all the markings from the templates to the wrong side of my fabric so that I can work with that as I'm putting this together. Now it's also really important to note with this little pattern, so here we have the flap and here we have the back, and the back has the more rounded end and the flap has the flatter curve on the other end. So just make sure when you are fusing your interfacing into place that you are paying attention that you have the rounded end first on this one and the flatter end on this one. And then on the lining piece here, we have the same thing, and don't get this confused. So once you're aware of this, it is a lot more obvious. So I'm going to go ahead and fuse all of this, and I'll meet you back here. Here we have all the fused pieces, and I need to point out that sometimes your interfacing and your fleece is going to shift a little bit when you fuse it, and that's actually okay. You just need to do your best to get it in the center. What I'm going to do though is, because I want my dart markings to be really accurate, I'm going to put my template back on top of this piece where the interfacing and fleece is, and just remark the points of my dart here. And so then I can see that's actually where I need to be stitching from the outer edges of this triangle into the center. So I'm just going to set the flap and the back and the lining aside, and we're going to work on creating the darts for the front. So take the first front that has the interfacing and fleece fused on it. So we're going to fold this right sides together down the center of that triangle, and we're going to bring the arms of that dart together. So you're going to match them up and make sure that these raw edges of this curve are aligning. You might need to sort of tip this forwards and backwards so you can see that those markings are lining up. And you can just grab a clip and clip that together to hold that in place. So now we're going to take that to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch from the outer edge on that line into the center and stop stitching on that dot. So just take this slowly and make sure that you back stitch well, because we're going to be pushing on this seam and giving it a little bit of pressure to help it get a really nice shape. While we're here, we can take the second front, and we're going to repeat this process by folding this right sides together and aligning the arms of that dart together and the raw edges meeting. Clip that together, and we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch from the outer edge into that dot and stop. So then you can repeat that for the second dart here and the second dart on this side as well. So now we have the darts on both of these fronts completed, and you want to press the darts on each front in opposite directions. I'm going to press these inwards, the fleecy side, and just give that a little press with the iron. You can see that I'm keeping this as a little cup shape here, just to help it keep its shape. And you can also just put your fingers in there and give that a bit of a tug and help give that a really nice cupped shape. Now on the second front, we want to press these darts in the opposite direction to how we press them here. So I've pressed them inwards here, and on this side I'm going to press them outwards. So you can start by finger pressing that and then take it to the iron and just get the little iron in there. You can still do this with a big iron, works just as fine. So this side that doesn't have any interfacing on it is going to be basically my front lining, so you're not going to see this one. So now we're going to take these fronts and place them right sides together, and we're going to align this top curved edge and match these center points and just put a few clips along there. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch starting from that outer edge across into the point of that interfacing. And then we're going to follow that interfacing edge around to the other point and then stitch across and out to the other raw edge on this outer mark. So now we're going to cut this seam down by about half. And I'm going to make some little clips into this curve, just perpendicular to that seam line. And I'm cutting close to that stitching, but not through it. So this is just going to help this curve open out when we turn this right sides out. So now turn this right sides out, so the wrong sides are together. And we're going to push out the edges of that curve and the tops of those little points and roll that edge between your fingers. Now you might like to just use the blade of your scissors tip to push those points out, and we want to get that seam edge exactly on the edge and nicely opened out. So then I'm going to hit that with the iron, and you can press it from both sides. Now if you're not happy with the way the curve is looking the first time that you've pressed it, while the fabric is hot, this is a great time to just keep manipulating and pulling on this and pushing with the scissors if you need to, and just get everything to look a bit more symmetrical if you haven't got that looking great the first time. So now with these two fronts wrong sides together, we're going to be basting around this outer edge. So we're going to flip around to the bottom of that curve again. We're going to match up those center points, and we're going to make sure that these darts seams here are nesting, so that one of them is going one direction and the other one on the other front is going the opposite direction. So just wiggle that with your fingers until you can feel that that is sitting nicely together, and do the same with the second one. Now you can clip around this edge if you would like, but because this is quite a little project and it's quite hard to get into, I'm going to just be glue basting just around this edge here. So I'm just going to use just the tiniest amount of glue just inside that seam allowance. I've just done a little trail of glue there, and I'm just going to take that front again and realign that, match all those marks up again, and then just set that in place with the iron to dry that glue. So now you can go ahead and just clip the remaining edges with a couple of clips on these raw edges. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch across this top curved edge at a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we're going to baste around this curved outer edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now our front is top stitched and basted, and now we're going to mark the placement for the elastic loop that's going to hold the flap closed. So from this top curved top stitched edge that we've just sewn, we're going to mark 5/8 of an inch down from this straight edge, and just place a mark within that seam allowance on each of those raw edges. Now if you are working with the narrow flat elastic or the 2mm round elastic, you're just going to cut a length of elastic that's a little bit longer than the width of the front here. And the reason I make it just a little bit longer is just because it's a little bit easier to hold on to when we're clipping this in place. So I'm just going to align that on top of the marks here, and you're wanting it to be basically flush across the front. So you'll be able to make sure that you can do that when you're at the sewing machine. So today for this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to make a little flap closure out of fabric. So I've cut a little piece of fabric here on the bias that is 1 inch wide, and I'm going to be sewing this into a tube and then turning this right sides out. So I'm just going to trim off the ends of this fabric to make them flush, and then I'm going to run a little bit of glue just down this edge in the seam allowance and fold this right sides together along this long edge, just to get those raw edges meeting here. So set that with the iron. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch down this raw edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to turn this tube right side out. There's a number of different ways that you can do that. You can stitch this so that there's a thread running down the center of that tube that you can tug on and pull from the other side. I've seen people use tubes. So my favorite way for turning one of these very narrow tubes right side out is to use one of these spaghetti strap turners. So this is essentially a rod with a little latch hook on the end. So you just feed that down inside that tube, and with the little latch hook on the end here, you're going to actually poke a little hole so that it pokes through, and then close that latch hook. So just pull up on it and pull on the other end here on with this ring, and just gradually feed that back down until it comes out the other side. And you can take it off the little rod and then just keep feeding it until the whole thing is right side out. So this is looking really cute. It's a nice even tube, and because we've cut it on the bias, it's going to have a little bit of stretch to it, so that when we've got pens and things inside of the pen holder, this is going to have a bit of give to it. So give this a little bit of a press. So now take your front and align this tube on top of those marks and clip that in place. So I'll just trim off a bit of the excess here. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to base this tube in place at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to attach the elastic strap to the back. So take the back piece, so this is the piece with the rounder end, and on the right side we're going to align this piece of elastic over that center mark and clip that in place, and then keeping the shiny side up without twisting it, we're going to clip that onto the other end, onto the curved edge here, and center that over that center mark. Now this is where, if you're using a different elastic to what I'm using, and even sometimes a different brand, you can find that this has a different amount of stretch. So what I'm proposing that you do here is just do a little trial fitting of this elastic. So just grab your notebook, and then we're going to open that out and feed that around the front cover of the book and pull it tight. And then you want to pinch that on that mark, and then holding that there, you're just going to basically feel how loose and floppy this is. So you might want to pull your elastic a little bit tighter than this. Just imagine that you've got some the weight of some pens in here. Just have a think about how it might hang when it's in front like that. And you might want to just keep your elastic a little bit longer than what I've said there as well. So just do that trial fitting, and then you should be happy with how tight this is going to fit on your final project. So then we're going to take this back piece to the sewing machine, and we're going to baste across each end of this elastic at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now you're going to take your front piece, and we're going to place this right sides together over this elastic edge and align these straight edges, match up these center marks, and just put a couple of clips in place. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch down this straight edge at 3/8 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to give this seam a very quick press. Just be careful of that fleece, that you don't press that for too long. And then we're going to press that seam towards the back, so towards the pointier end. So then we're going to hold this elastic on that center seam up out of the way, and we're going to top stitch along this back edge at a scant 1/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to catch that seam that we've just pressed in that top stitching that we do, and make sure that we don't catch this elastic as we are stitching it. So now take this combined back and flap section, and we're going to fold this elastic up within this seam allowance here to hold it all out of the way inside of that back piece. And then take your front section, and we're going to place this with the elastic or the fabric strip down and push these points on these darts back up towards this floppy lining side. And we're going to align the bottom center point on this bottom curve with the bottom center point on that elastic on the bottom of that curve. So lining all these up together and clipping that in place. Now this is where you need to start being as accurate as you can to get all this curve meeting nicely and everything aligning really straight. So getting all those layers nicely meeting, and we're going to clip all the way up to the top here of this top edge, and I'm going to align the top edge of my front here with the mark here on the back edge. That's where the top of this wants to go. So clip together down the side edge here. So I'm using plenty of clips here just to make all this work. Now this front is wider than the back piece that we're clipping it to, so it fits around the bottom of the curve, but as we come up the sides of the raw edges, the front gets wider, and so I'm going to be pushing the bulk of that fabric in towards the center and out of the seam allowance. So I'm aligning this edge to this mark here that I've got on the back, and then clipping my way back down these raw edges until everything is nicely aligned. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to be basting the front onto the back here, and I'm going to be using a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance. We want to be pushing all of that in towards the center and making sure we don't have any puckers. So you want to be paying attention that you're doing a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance, and as you come around this bottom curve, you're going to be pushing everything in and up towards the center so that you can stitch flat around this curve and keep all those edges and layers nicely together. So now we're on the home stretch. So you're going to lay your project right side up so that the flap is at the top and your front is at the bottom facing upwards, and keep your elastic strap tucked nicely down inside. We're going to take the lining and place that right sides together on top of the whole project. So make sure that you've got the flat edge of this curve aligning with this flap edge here, and this pointier end of the curve aligning with the pointier end of the back here. So match up your center marks front and back here on this flap and clip everything together. So once again, we're going to be pushing this bulky front part in and down so that all of that bulk is not getting caught in the seam allowance. Put plenty of clips around each of the bottom curves. So now we're going to tug on the whole project just to open it all out. And while you're tugging on it, I will pinch and hold all those layers together and put a clip there, because this lining isn't going to want to let all of those layers sit nicely under there. So you're going to have to teach it that it can actually do it. You're just going to show it. So tug on all those layers and pull that tight, and while you're pinching it,
going to add some more clips just to ease all those layers together nicely so they sit flat. So now we've got this all clipped together, I like to sew it from the other side. So just flip this over and we're going to mark an opening on the left hand edge of the flap. So I like to allow just a bit less than 3 inches here. So just mark that within your seam allowance with your pen. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to start stitching here on my mark and follow my interfacing round the flap all the way down. Now as I come onto the part where the front is and this bulk is, you'll be able to feel that this is a little bit trickier and bulkier to sew here. So this is where you might like to switch up your needle to a 90. We're going to be trying to sew exactly on that stitching line from before or just inside it so that it's hidden, because we don't want to see that row of basting that we stitched from before. So I'm going to stitch all the way around. As I'm going around, I'm pushing all those layers in towards the center of the front and out of the seam allowance, and I'm going to finish on this mark here and make sure that we backstitch really well. So now we want to trim this seam allowance down, but we're not going to trim it around the entire edge. We're going to leave it long across the elastic ends and where the strap is meeting here, and also across this opening here. So I'm going to start just past that opening here, and I'm going to cut the seam allowance down by about half. I'm going to ease out again just when I come to where this elastic or this fabric strap is. Okay, trim around this curve, just tapering off again when I come to where the elastic strap is, and then back on again the remainder of this curve, carefully around this flap, and then just back out again before we come to that opening. So this is where we get to turn the whole project right side out. Now this is a bit challenging, so I do recommend that you have your hemostats on hand and you just work at this slowly and carefully. So we're just going to reach into that opening and we're going to start just gently pushing all these layers out. So we're going to try really hard not to tug on that opening on the stitching too much, because we don't want to rip it. We don't want to pop the stitches. And we also, I want you to try and avoid tugging on the elastic strap. So that will be very tempting because it's something that you can grab quite easily for this, but I'm a bit worried that if we pull on it, it might overstretch before we've even had a chance to get it onto the book. So as soon as you can't do any more with your fingers again, you're just going to grab your hemostats here and just start reaching in just very gently, and be careful what you grab, and just tug on bits of the fabric until you can feel that everything is coming out really nicely. You can also use your hemostats to push. So take your time here. You can finish by rolling everything with your fingers, but just doing it really gently because we don't want to snag any of the fabric or the elastic. So now I'm happy with how this is looking. I'm just going to finish pushing out the rest of this flap here. And if you think that this curve needs a little bit of help just to get symmetrical, just gently use the blade of your scissors to scrape along the inner seam there. So now I'm going to start giving this a press. And in a minute we're going to start working on getting that opening looking really nice. So just keep the elastic out of the way, and we're going to press the edge of that seam allowance. Don't worry too much about getting the shape of the front looking good right now. We're going to be crushing this just for a little bit while we work on getting this outer seam nice and smooth. So I really want to work on getting that edge right on the edge. So rolling that with my fingers so that none of the front is poking around to the back and none of the back is poking around to the front. Okay, so now I'm going to start just tucking everything inside for this seam allowance. And one of the ways you just work on this, you just have to start pressing. So the first time you press it, it's likely not going to be exactly where you want it. But while the fabric is warm, you can keep pulling and tugging, pushing and pulling a little bit more in and out until you're happy that everything is sitting nice and straight. So I'm happy with that now. I'm going to glue baste this opening shut. And just set that with the iron. So now I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch the final seam. So I'm going to be top stitching around the entire edge of this project. So I'm going to start, I've got the front facing upwards, I'm going to start on this right hand edge here, just above where the front joins onto the back and the flap. So stitching very slowly and carefully at a scant 1/8 of an inch. Now as we come to the part where the layers get quite thick again, I'm just going to go very slowly. Make sure you've got your size 90 needle in if your machine is going to need that. And we're going to make sure that this elastic is out of the way. So as we come around, make sure that you're not catching that underneath. You want to keep this down and out of the way and just stretch it as you go around. And once again, you're going to be pushing the bulk of this front towards the center and away from that seam. So now we're ready to give this project its final press. So just press the flap and the back, and then to press a bit of shape back into this front section, I'm just going to grab just a few fabric strips and scraps and just shove a whole heap of that down in there, just to give this front a little bit of body so that I can press, so really pad that out. Make that pretty firm, and then you can press that with the iron and get all those construction creases out. And then just pull all that out again, and then you can fill this with pens. So you can fit a variety of different pens in here depending on the height. You can fit 3 pens in here, and they fit nice and snugly. You can fit highlighters in here, and I think I've probably gone and made my fabric strap a little bit too tight to fit 3 pens in here, so you might like to just pay attention to that when you're doing that. If you're going to use this fabric strip, just make it just a little bit looser than I have because it's a little bit tight to close. It still works, it's just not as functional. So just slide that flap underneath there, then you can slide that onto your book. It sits very beautifully on the cover like that. So of course I want to try it on the Crafted Life Companion as well. So let's just slide this onto this front flap here, and that just looks amazing. So cute. So there we go. I hope that you give this little Inkwell pattern a go, and if you do, leave me a comment below and let me know how you went, as I love to see your projects and hear about your success stories.